The court will recall the docket for October 20, 2023, Division L. Court will recall the case of people of the state of Colorado v. Nathan Woodyard, 21 CR 2794. Mr. Woodyard's here with both of his counsel. And the prosecution is present as well. Anything before the jurors return? Please be seated. All right, the court will formally recall people of the state of Colorado v. Nathan Woodyard. Ms. Ward is on the witness stand, still under oath. Before we broke for lunch, I guess I don't know why 3 slipped out of my mouth instead of 1:30, but it did. But I also wanted to let you know, and I meant to let you know about this before you took your break for lunch. The trial in this case will not be in session on Monday. So hopefully you can get some other things done that you need to get done in normal circumstances, I suppose. But I will ask you to return Tuesday morning at around 8:30. Sorry, I didn't let you know a little sooner. I wasn't absolutely certain until somewhat recently. So we can start the cross-examination of the witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Officer Ward, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So to back up a little bit, you were not dispatched to this scene, so to speak. Is that correct?
Correct.
You heard something on the radio, right?
Yes.
And because of what you heard on the radio, you decided to respond there, right?
Yes.
What you heard on the radio to you sounded like there could be something of concern, something going on, of a fight or something emergent.
Yes, that's what I thought.
You didn't have really any information about what was happening at the scene, right?
No.
But you heard on the radio that officers were asking for help, essentially, right?
Yes, they were asking for emergent assistance.
And they also called for fire, right?
I believe so, yes. Well, they responded, so yes.
Well, and when an officer calls for fire, is that like a layperson or a citizen calling 911?
It's essentially officers saying they need medical assistance.
You did not call for medical assistance, is that right?
Correct, I did not.
When you arrived and you are coming upon this scene, you see a number of police officers surrounding an individual on the ground. Do you recall?
Yes.
There were 3 or 4 officers surrounding who we now know to be Mr. McClain. Does that sound right to you?
Yes, I believe between 3 and 5 were in the vicinity.
So just initially, in terms of what you observed, the officers who were down on the ground with Mr. McClain included Officer Woodyard, right?
Yes, I believe so.
Officer Rosenblatt, do you recall?
Yes.
Officer Rodema, do you recall?
Yes.
And Sergeant Leonard standing over them, right?
They were nearby. Like I said, I couldn't recall exactly where everybody was, but yes, nearby. I believe Sergeant Leonard was standing to the right, and at least 3 people were kneeling next to Mr. McClain.
In terms of the 3 people who were kneeling, you were asked questions about whether Mr. Woodyard at that moment appeared to be taking Mr. McClain's pulse. Do you remember that question?
I do.
Okay. And Mr. Woodyard, as far as you saw, did not take his pulse at that time, right?
Correct.
Could you hear Mr. McClain making sounds?
I believe I heard a little bit maybe when I first went up, but like I said before, like I didn't notice much about that since it seemed I I didn't think I was needed right next to him at that point, so I didn't pay very much attention. That's when Sergeant Leonard asked me to go call the reporting party. So I believe I heard some noises then, but from what I remember, I more strongly remember it when I came back.
Now, you had just mentioned that Sergeant Leonard asked you to do something, and that's when you went to go call the reporting party. Um, Is Sergeant Leonard your direct supervisor?
At that time, he was not my direct supervisor. He's a patrol sergeant.
On a scene like this or during an incident like this, the presence of a sergeant on scene means that he is supervising. Would you agree with that?
Yes,
I should say he or she, right?
correct.
It is the sergeant who may assign different tasks to different officers, right?
Typically.
And it is the sergeant's job to sort of organize the scene, if you will,
Yes, usually.
and also to make sure that police are getting all of the information needed, correct?
Yes, I would say generally speaking, if a patrol sergeant's on scene, they're usually in charge unless somebody higher than them is on scene.
Sergeant Leonard asked you to go call the reporting party um, because this was still an investigation of sorts. Would you agree with that?
Yes,
The whole reason that you were sent to call the person who called 911 is because officers wanted to know what the nature of that report was, correct?
I believe so, yes.
And they wanted more information about the person who has been apprehended, right?
Yes, I believe so.
The point was for you to try to get more information, right?
Yes,
And I won't ask you to go into the conversation, but you did make contact with someone, correct?
yes, on the phone.
Okay, and you were able to confirm that 911 was called.
Yes,
And you were able to confirm that a description had been given.
yes,
There were details that you sort of walked through with the RP or the reporting party.
yes,
And then you come back and you follow up with Sergeant Leonard, correct?
yes. I told him an overview of the phone call.
And Sergeant Leonard wasn't just telling you what to do, but he was also speaking with the other officers who were present. Do you recall?
Yes, that's what it seemed like.
There was a second sergeant who arrived on scene named Sergeant Nunez. Do you recall that?
Yes, I recall her being there. I recall her being less involved than Sergeant Leonard, though.
After your initial arrival and observing the officers around Mr. McClain, Officer Woodyard does not remain on the ground with him. Is that true?
Yes, I believe so. So from what I recall, I didn't see it happen, but when I came back, it looked like he was no longer with him and there was another officer there assisting.
You did not see Officer Woodyard stand up and sort of remove himself from Mr. McClain. Is that correct?
I don't recall that.
You don't know why he would have done that, right?
No,
But he didn't stay on the ground with the other officers, continuing to restrain him throughout the duration of your presence on the scene, right?
correct.
When you initially, and to be fair, when you initially observed the officers surrounding Mr. McClain, you didn't have a ton of time to really evaluate him, right?
Correct.
If I asked you what was happening with him, would you recall seeing anything specific or anything of concern?
I just recall believing that he was handcuffed and that I didn't think I was needed there, but no, I don't really know specifics.
After you did some of the follow-up investigation, you came back and were back present with the other officers who were either on the ground or standing over Mr. McClain, right?
Yes,
And Mr. Woodyard was no longer there, right?
correct.
I want to talk to you about that moment where you are able to get closer to Mr. McClain, okay? Because you did get quite close to him. Would you agree with that?
Yes,
You got down on the ground, right?
yes,
With the other officers who were restraining him on the ground, correct?
yes.
And there were at all times 3 of you doing that. Is that right?
I believe so. I didn't pay super close attention to near where his feet were. I believe there was a third officer there the whole time, but I'm not 100% positive.
Well, after the initial, your initial response, when you came back after making the 911 call, you got down on the ground. So that's 1, right? I'd have to make you say yes or no.
Oh, sorry, yes,
Um, Officer Rodema was still on the ground restraining Mr. McClain, correct?
yes.
And Officer Green was restraining Mr. McClain, correct?
I believe so. He's the one that I'm not positive if he would have like stepped away or not because I wasn't paying. I like didn't see over there very well. But yes, I believe so. He was there at the feet.
And Officer Green had actually traded positions with Officer Rosenblatt, who was initially restraining Mr. McClain when you arrived. Do you recall that?
I do recall that I believed it was Officer Rosenblatt at first and that Officer Green was there. Like I said, I didn't see like the transition that happened, but when I came back, I believe that's who was there, Officer Green.
And in the short amount of time that you observed Officer Woodyard, where the prosecution has pointed out near the head of Mr. McClain, you didn't see him doing anything that would injure or cause Mr. McClain any pain at that moment.
No, like I said, I didn't really see much of anything.
Well, let's talk about when you were able to see. When you got down near Mr. McClain and you were pretty close to the back of his head and the side of his face. Would you agree with that?
Yes,
You could feel that he was moving. Is that right?
yes,
He was making some sounds, right?
yes.
And those sounds did not cause you any concern?
Not particularly, no.
You didn't know what they were. Is that right?
Right, I think I would best categorize them as groans, but I didn't really know why or what they were.
Could you tell whether he may have been in respiratory distress from the groans?
I couldn't tell.
Did you hear him gagging in any way?
I'm not sure if I could say gagging. I think, like I said, I'd say more like groans. I'm not sure.
You did not hear him vomiting at that time?
No, I don't recall hearing him vomit.
Never heard him gasping for air or saying that he couldn't breathe?
No.
And you were down on the ground with him for several minutes. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
At all times, with 2 other police officers physically restraining him, right?
Yeah, like I said, the feet, I can't say for 100% certainty, but yes, I believe so.
And you had talked about thinking that he might be sort of a safety risk to officers. Is that right?
Yes.
At that moment, did you have a lot of information about what had happened with him?
No, I didn't.
Did you
No.
have information about why he was being restrained?
No.
Did you think that maybe he could be sick?
I was under the impression he was under arrest and that likely there had been like some sort of fight before my arrival, but no, I didn't know.
So you were making impressions, but these are not things that you actually knew.
Correct.
And are there, in your training and experience, in terms of how you are reacting to him, have you experienced times where people are resisting arrest or something happens unexpectedly? Or essentially, why are you assisting and pinning him to the ground with no information about why?
Basically because, like I said before, from my understanding of what happened before, so when we get on scenes, especially something like that, where you had to go quickly, you don't have much information. I really have to go off of the officers that know more than I do. It's not safe, or you don't have time often to ask all the details that everybody knows. So I believed, like I said, since he was handcuffed and he was on the ground and looked like he was being restrained, that he was under arrest. So I was just trying to assist with that.
Okay, fair to say you had a few minutes to interact with him before you're on the ground restraining him.
Or I would say probably less, since I stepped away to call the person and then came back, and then it was pretty soon after that, I believe, within a few minutes, maybe.
And still, as far as you can tell, everyone's in the process of trying to get more information.
Yeah, it seemed like that, yes.
There were things that Officer Rodema was saying to Mr. McClain in terms of telling him to stop moving around. Do you remember Officer Rodema speaking with him?
I do recall him saying at least one thing about stop moving or something like that.
And the sergeant who's standing over the other officers was also talking with Mr. McClain, telling him, don't do that, in reference to him trying to kick his legs, right?
Yes, I believe Sergeant Leonard said something like that.
Now, whether Mr. McClain is in medical distress and doing these things because he's trying to reposition himself, is that something that you knew then?
No,
Is that something that you understand may have been going on now?
I understand that now.
Did you ever hear Officer Woodyard giving Mr. McClain any commands or telling him anything?
Not that I can recall.
You were present, as we discussed, with Mr. McClain and these other officers while he was injected with what you now know to be ketamine. Do you recall those lines of questions?
Yes,
Did any of those other officers in that moment check Mr. McClain's pulse that you saw?
not that I saw.
Did any of those other officers in that moment check Mr. McClain's breathing that you saw?
Not that I saw.
And in that moment, Officer Woodyard was not present with Mr. McClain.
I don't know exactly where he was, but yeah, he was not in my immediate vicinity with Mr. McClain on the ground. I don't know if he was behind me or what, but
Well, and I want to understand that. So we're talking about a pretty dynamic scene. Would you agree with that?
yes,
Lots of officers have responded, right?
yes,
And there are, upwards of 10 police officers there.
it sounds about right. I don't know exactly.
There are officers who are in the vicinity, right?
Yes,
And there are officers who continue to engage in restraining Mr. McClain on the ground, right?
yes,
And in terms of the officers who continued restraining him, that's not this officer sitting here with me, right?
correct.
Officers moving around the vicinity are interacting with sergeants, correct?
Yes,
Officers moving around the vicinity are getting different orders or commands from sergeants, right? And rephrase.
Sustained.
Officers who are in the vicinity, you don't know what everyone's doing.
correct.
And in a scene like this, officers sort of do different things, correct?
Yes,
There are a lot of things that have to be done, right?
yes,
There's documenting things, correct?
correct.
You picked up that mask, right?
Yes,
There's cordoning off the scene with tape for photographing, right?
we did do that a little bit later, but yes,
There's basic tasks that everybody has to do, and everybody has a different role in a scene like this.
yes,
And they often will get directions from officers who are higher ranking.
yes,
That is typical, right?
typical, yes.
Just preceding, and I suppose surrounding that injection that was given by paramedics, you were asked a number of questions by the prosecution about whether Mr. McClain in those moments was in a recovery position just before lunch, right?
Yes,
And you were saying that he was not all the way in a recovery position, but maybe not all the way pressed against the ground. Is that right?
yes,
And you were asked questions suggesting that you were hesitating or not, discussing this recovery position, right?
yes,
And you were asked a question about whether you formerly worked with Mr. Woodyard, right?
yes,
Officer Ward, when Mr. McClain was on the ground in that moment, those were your hands behind his neck. Is that right?
yes,
Not Officer Woodyard's, right?
correct.
In fact, The names of those officers who were restraining him in that fashion were Officer Rodema, right?
Yes.
Officer Green, right?
Yes.
And Officer Ward, right?
Yes.
And so the questions about whether he was in a recovery position, you were one of those officers restraining him in that moment, correct?
Yes.
You have testified previously that when you first arrived, you grabbed him by the arm. Do you remember that?
Yes. And when I went back up, obviously not the very first time when I didn't really notice, but yes, when I went back up.
That when you physically engaged him, you grabbed Mr. McClain's arm in a way to keep him from toppling over, right?
Yes, that was before I transitioned to the head near this and had the pressure point.
So he's going from being sort of upright. I mean, the position is changing. Is that right?
I would say it changed at least from when I got there.
Right. And his face is more toward the grass, correct?
Like the side of his head was on the grass, I would say. I would say from what I recall, his head was always sideways. It was his body, I guess, that partially toppled over, like I mentioned before.
And in terms of how officers were restraining him, there were directions being given about that, right?
I suppose, yes, with if you're referring to Officer Rodema and just the medical staff and stuff being there too.
Well, officers were saying, I'm going to move him this way to keep him from kicking. I'm paraphrasing, but something like that, right?
Yes,
That officer's name was Officer Rodema, discussing how to move him, right?
that I can recall, yes, he did.
You were given an instruction to put your knuckles behind the back of his ear, right?
In that area, yes.
That instruction was given to you by an officer named Officer Rodema, right?
Yes,
Mr. McClain was being given instructions to stop moving, right?
yes,
That instruction was given to him by an officer named Sergeant Leonard, right?
yes, I believe.
People are discussing or instructing each other what to do with respect to Mr. McClain, correct?
Yes,
Never an instruction, a directive, or a suggestion from Officer Woodyard. Is that right?
not that I recall.
And in fact, when we talk about a scene like this anyway, right, just generally, sometimes one officer will sort of take over, if you will, as primary. Is that right?
It's pretty common.
Very common for one officer to just start calling the shots, right?
Yes,
And that's not necessarily the officer who was the first to be dispatched, correct?
correct, not always.
Sometimes it's an officer on scene who just sort of takes charge, right?
Yes,
Sometimes it's an officer on scene who happens to be higher ranking, right?
yes,
Sometimes it's an officer on scene who is just more experienced or has been with the force longer, right?
yes,
You are aware that Officer Rodema was Officer Woodyard's more senior officer, not in rank, but had been a police officer for longer.
I actually didn't know when they started, so.
Perfect. But in terms of who is telling who what to do with respect to Mr. McClain, it's Officer Rodema.
I would say I heard Officer Rodema tell me and others things, and I did not hear Officer Woodyard, so.
And when you arrived, of the officers, there were officers who remained with Mr. McClain the entire time you were present on scene, and that was Officer Rodema.
That I'm aware of, yes.
So we've talked about multiple officers, Rosenblatt, Rodema, Leonard, Green. Officer Root was standing nearby.
Yes,
Officer Dunson was very close to Mr. McClain at times, right?
yes, I don't recall exactly when, but at times, yes.
Did any of those officers check his pulse?
Not that I saw.
Did any of those officers sort of intervene with Officer Rodema, who was sort of giving directions at that point?
Not that I saw.
With respect to everyone who was standing around, there were also medical professionals standing around Mr. McClain on the ground, right?
Yes, this, again, the second time when I went back, yes.
Thank you for clarifying. So when you have that second encounter with Mr. McClain, that's within a few minutes, right?
Yes,
So just in terms of the chronology, you've gone and spoken with the reporting party, correct?
yes,
You walked over to your patrol car and made that phone call from in your patrol car.
yes,
Officer Root accompanied you.
yes,
You went back to Sergeant Leonard to report back to him, correct?
yes,
And that's where he is still standing over the scene with Mr. McClain, right?
yes.
Talking about a couple minutes.
A few minutes, yeah, I don't know exactly. But
And when you came back that second time, Aurora Fire is present, right?
yes,
There are firefighters standing around Mr. McClain who's on the ground,
yes,
a few of them.
yes, I couldn't tell you exactly how many, but multiples.
But you see their fire pants with the stripe, right?
Yes,
And there's 2, 3, 4.
something like that, yeah, I don't know exactly.
So when medical arrives on scene, what does that mean to you?
So typically when medical arrives, they would be in charge of medical decisions while we're still in charge of like criminal charging type decisions.
Well, when medical arrived, Elijah McClain remained on the ground, right?
Yes,
And did you see the firefighters getting down on the ground with him?
no,
Did you see the firefighters trying to observe him?
I mean, they were nearby and to me it looked like they were watching him. I didn't see any of them kneel or anything, but
Did you see the firefighters try to speak with him?
I don't recall that. I don't recall seeing that.
You were asked questions about, I don't remember if you were asked this, so I'll ask you. Did you have a conversation with firefighters about what you observed while you were so close with Mr. McClain?
I did not.
Why is that?
I guess I didn't think it was necessary, or I thought they were, had the medical side of things taken care of, so I didn't think it was necessary.
Did you think that they were going to assess Mr. McClain?
That's what I thought.
Why not tell them he's been making sounds and groaning?
I just thought they probably would have heard it themselves.
I mean, there certainly was an opportunity for you to provide information to firefighters, right?
Yes,
And based on what you saw, and I understand when you came, based upon what you saw, you had a much longer opportunity to observe Mr. McClain than what you observed Mr. Woodyard doing. This is what, let
Sustained.
me ask it a different way. You were down on the ground with Mr. McClain with your knuckles in the back of his ear, correct?
in the front, but yeah, like right in this area.
So like a foot or so from his face
Yes,
for several minutes.
yes,
And there would have been an opportunity for you to say to firefighters, so here's what I saw going on, right? Well, this is circling back with the foundation, Your Honor.
Well, it has been asked and answered, so you don't need to circle.
Okay. You did not tell the firefighters anything about what you heard.
I'll allow it.
I did not.
Did they ask you?
Not that I heard.
Did you ever hear a firefighter or a medic ask anybody if you heard what happened?
I did not hear that.
You testified that you, and I don't remember what you said, so forgive me. You saw Mr. McClain vomit at the time?
No, I saw that there was what I believe is vomit on the ground in front of him. I never actually saw him throw up that I'm aware of.
So you saw that there was vomit on the ground, you said, right?
Yes, what looked like vomit, yes.
And in fact, people are talking about the fact that he had vomited all around you, right?
Yes, I was told. Mhm.
I mean, at some point someone said to you, be careful where you step, right?
Yes,
And another officer was asking if anybody has any wipes, right?
don't recall that specifically.
But the discussion about vomit happens, and there's vomit on the ground, right where the medical personnel are with the police officers over Mr. McClain?
Yes.
Just literally vomit on the ground by him.
Yes.
You said that you didn't know what Mr. McClain was being injected with, correct?
Correct. At the time, I did not.
After that shot, that injection, Mr. McClain became unconscious. Do you recall that?
I recall that when he was put on the gurney, he looked like he was probably unconscious or going in and out of consciousness. Not sure exactly, for sure if he was or exactly when that happened.
Okay, well, it looked like he needed assistance even to just be put on the gurney, right?
That's what it looked like.
His head had to be supported, right?
I believe so.
And you got to see him as he was being put on the gurney, correct?
Yes.
And you could see it looked like there was throw up coming out of his mouth, right?
I think I saw a substance like in his nose mouth area that might have matched what was on that mask and on the ground.
And just in terms of the timing here, the sequence of events, that observation you make is directly after all the minutes that you and Officer Rodima and Officer Green have been restraining him on the ground, right?
Yes.
I had asked you about whether you ever saw Mr. Woodyard giving any directions or saying anything with respect to Mr. McClain or you. Did you ever hear him giving any instructions about what to do here?
Not that I heard.
You were shown a video, and I'm not going to ask you what you see on a video, but I do want to ask you if you remember something. I just want to show a video that you've already seen that the Attorney General was permitted to show you. And we're just going to play another 3 seconds of it, and then I'm going to ask you a question.
Which exhibit are we playing?
Four.
All right.
We're just going to play the same, so you just a couple seconds longer.
More down here? Okay, it's right there. Okay. All right.
I think that's Rosie.
Yeah.
Here in a minute, once this benefit kicks in, we're gonna uncuff and put him on the bed,
Okay.
and then we're gonna restrain him soft underneath the bed.
All right, let me go step up. No, you're okay. I got it.
So you were asked questions about whether you remembered Mr. Woodyard being told by someone what they were going to do with Mr. McClain. Do you remember being asked that?
I believe so. Yes.
Do you remember being asked before lunch whether you remembered Mr. Woodyard putting on gloves to do something?
Yes.
And remind me, whose voice is that telling everybody what to do in that clip?
The one talking about getting him on the pram first is Officer Rodima. I don't know who the voice of the person that just said, no, you're good. I don't know that voice.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you knew whose voice that was. Okay. You don't remember whether Sergeant Leonard might have told Mr. Woodyard, no need, something, yeah.
I don't recall.
That wasn't part of the video you were shown earlier, though. Is that right?
That end part, no.
You would agree this is a tough case, right?
Yes.
And that there were lots of officers who could have done something to help Mr. McClain. You'd agree with that?
There were a lot of officers on scene.
Who could have helped Mr. McClain? Would you agree?
Yes.
And I just want to make sure I have this right. In the moments right before the ketamine, or even the minutes leading up, the people pinning him to the ground, you, Rodema, Green, correct?
We're the ones with Mr. McClain, yes.
Thank you. Firefighter standing over him, right?
Yes.
Okay. And a sergeant.
I know you want to do a big sum up, but these have been asked and answered.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Redirect.
Officer Ward, I just want to talk about that concept that you were just talking about with the defense attorney of, different people on the scene and different people giving suggestions or giving directions to each other. In your experience on APD, is that pretty common that different officers, even non-sergeants, non-commanders, will offer suggestions or give directions to each other?
Yes.
If somebody who's a fellow officer, even a sergeant, tells you to do something that you think goes against your training, can you disagree?
Yes.
If a fellow officer or even a sergeant tells you to do something that you disagree with, just as a personal matter, can you say no?
Yes.
If a sergeant or another person wants you to do something that's dangerous to somebody, can you say no?
Yes.
On the other side of things, if a fellow officer, even if it's just another patrol officer, same rank as you, suggests that you do something, do you have the option to say yes?
Yes.
And you discussed this important concept that, sometimes you need to rely on fellow officers to get information because you don't know everything. Can you tell the jury why you have to do that sometimes?
Yes. Yeah. Basically, it's just not safe and there's not enough time to get all the information ahead of time. We can't, every single one of us, talk to every single person and see everything. It's not practical and it's not realistic. Especially in situations where it's evolving quickly, it's not safe to wait for that.
Okay. So do you rely, and do your fellow officers rely on the people who were there earlier to tell you whatever might be important from that?
Typically, yes.
Okay. Is that particularly true of information that pertains to officer safety or suspect safety?
Yes, I would say so.
Particularly true of medical information that's really important to safety?
Yes.
Would it be fair to say that you work as a team with your fellow officers to do that?
Yes.
I'd like to talk a little bit about some of that teamwork, and I promise I'm not going to make us go through the whole video again, but I do want to play just one portion. Exhibit 181, Sergeant Nunez's camera, starting at 22:58:48.
I just came back early, we just brought it, let them know, so. I imagine this guy's not even going to jail tonight, based on this, there's no way. You okay?
Yeah, I'm good. Everybody is good.
Was that Sergeant Leonard to Sergeant Nunez's left in the left of the frame?
Sorry, I didn't catch it. It did sound like his voice.
Okay. Go ahead and keep playing.
The Bemis camera got broken in the middle of all that.
Do we know where
We already talked to the RP, we got the
Woody's
RP.
camera is?
What's that?
We know where Woody's camera is?
Go ahead, if you guys are okay with the one company.
Do you know where your camera is?
No, it's by, it's by.
Oh,
Sorry, Woody, is that a nickname for Officer Woodyard?
Yes.
Somewhere down here? Okay, okay. Hey, Woodyard?
I think it's on.
Rosa,
Yeah.
here in a minute, once this medicine kicks in, we're gonna uncuff him, put him on the bed,
Okay,
and then we're gonna restrain him, stop him into the bed.
all right, let me grab the book.
No, you're okay, I got it.
Now, one of the things the defense asked you about was whether there's a lot of officers around doing a lot of different things, all kind of at the same time. Is the most important thing going on at this time in the video the health of the person in custody
I would say so.
and what's being done to that person in custody?
Yes.
Is that most important topic the topic Officer Redema was just asking Mr. Woodyard about?
I believe so. They were talking about putting him on the pram.
But that's all I have for you, officer. Thank you.
May the witness be excused. All right, you may step down, you're excused. Step over. And if you could state your name and spell your last name,
Elisa Gonzalez, Gonzalez.
just how do you spell your first name?
Aleesa.
Thank you. You're a witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Ms. Gonzalez.
Hello.
What do you do for a living?
I'm a paramedic.
And tell us what a paramedic is.
A paramedic responds to emergency medical situations, whether it be in the field or in the hospital or where I work at a prison.
And what are some of the medical procedures that you can do as a paramedic?
Give medications, do certain procedures such as intubating, doing IVs, running fluids, that sort of thing.
And I'm going to have you just scoot up to the microphone just a little bit. Have you ever testified before?
No,
How are you feeling today?
a little nervous.
Sure. I think everyone's a little nervous when they testify. Everything we say, the court reporter takes down. So we have to make sure that we don't speak on top of each other. And you have to answer out loud. You can't just nod your head.
Okay.
So let's step back and tell us again, what kind of paramedic procedures can you give on a patient?
We can administer medications, start IVs, do IV fluids, do procedures such as intubate or perform spinal immobilization, those sort of things.
And how was it that you became a paramedic?
I went to paramedic school
And when was that?
in 2020.
And how long does schooling last?
The classroom portion lasted 6 months, and the field externship was another 4 months.
Prior to you being a paramedic, did you have a role that was an assistant to a paramedic?
Yes,
What is that role?
that role is the EMT basic.
And what does that mean?
That means compared to a paramedic, my scope and my ability to administer certain medications, do certain procedures is less than a paramedic.
So what does an EMT basic do then?
Supports the paramedic, assists the paramedic, does more of the driving of the ambulance, deals more with the equipment and that sort of thing.
And when did you become an EMT basic?
2018.
And can you tell us a little bit about your training and education for that role?
That role took me 3 months to earn.
And before that, were you working in the medical field or was that the start of it?
That was the start of it. I was in college prior to that.
And did you graduate from college?
Yes.
And what was your degree?
A Bachelor of Science in Health and Exercise Science, Sports Medicine.
So I'm going to direct your attention to August 24th, 2019. What was your job then?
EMT Basic.
Who did you work for?
Falk, Rocky Mountain.
And what was the typical hours that you worked?
My shift at that time was 7 p.m. to 7 a.m.
Did you have a partner?
Yes.
Who was that?
Ryan Walker.
And if you were an EMT basic, what was Mr. Walker's role?
Paramedic.
And on August 24th, 2019, were you working?
Yes.
And were you working for?
Falk, Rocky Mountain.
And were your hours of operations for Falk the same that you just testified to?
Yes.
Were you dispatched to a call at Billings and Evergreen?
Yes.
Can you tell the jury how you got that call?
We got it. We were sitting in the ambulance and we got it from our dispatch and from Aurora Dispatch. We see it pop up on our screen and we respond.
Okay. And when you say you're sitting in the ambulance, what does that mean?
We basically sit there in the ambulance at an intersection somewhere in Aurora and wait for a call to come through on our speakers.
And is that what you do every time you're working?
Correct.
And I'm going to assume something, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but you're sort of waiting to see if you're needed. Is that right?
Yes.
So once you got the call to go to Billings and Evergreen, what happened next?
We drove over there. I believe I was in the passenger seat. We drove there. We parked and got out and did what we needed to do.
At the time that you got the dispatch, who are you getting the dispatch from?
Both Falk Rocky Mountain Dispatch as well as Aurora Dispatch.
Am I to believe that there's actually two dispatchers, one for the police and one for the Falk Ambulance Company?
Correct. There's also one for the fire department.
And do you remember at this point what information you were given about why you were being dispatched to that area?
I do not.
Are you typically given information or do they just tell you to go?
We are given information as far as the address, who else will be responding, and a brief chief complaint or unknown if they don't know what's going on.
Since this happened 4 years ago, do you just not remember what the chief complaint was, or do you think that you maybe weren't given any information?
I don't remember.
Fair enough. At the time that you were there, what was your role going to be on this scene?
Paramedic support.
So once again, for this scene, what was that going to look like?
Excuse me. Getting the stretcher out, getting our necessary equipment out and ready, bringing the stretcher up next to the patient, getting the seat belts and straps ready. If we needed restraints, getting those ready, and waiting until I needed.
Did you know at the time that you pulled up and got out of the passenger side that you would need the stretcher, or was that something that you learned once you were on scene?
I knew we would need the stretcher.
And at this point, do you remember why you knew that?
We go in to every call assuming we need the stretcher.
You do?
Yes.
So you may not know exactly what the patient's condition is, but you always bring the stretcher out?
Correct.
Do you know at this point when you got out, did you go and get the stretcher?
Yes.
And do you like gurney, stretcher, or pram? Which term do you like the most?
Does not matter.
Are they all the same thing?
Yes.
All right. So you get around, you go out the passenger side and you go around to get the stretcher. What is Mr. Walker doing, if you know?
I don't remember what he was doing when I got out.
Fair enough. So you go to the back of the ambulance and pull out the stretcher. What happens next?
I get the stretcher out by myself, and I believe a firefighter helps me pull it up the little hill to get it next to the patient.
Can you describe for the jury the relationship that you have with Aurora Fire and Rescue? Since you're coming from another company, how did the two companies interact with each other?
So Falk Rocky Mountain is a private ambulance company, and we contract with Aurora Fire Department to be the ambulances for them. Ultimately, Aurora Fire has medical control, meaning they have the final say in whatever decisions are made for the patient. And then Falk Rocky Mountain is the ambulance, and we assist them on calls.
And I want to make sure that we understand what medical control means. Could you explain that to the jury?
They have the final medical decision.
So you're there just simply to assist them to get the patient someplace.
Yes,
And when we think about the places that you take patients, are we talking about either a hospital or potentially a detention center?
just hospital.
So you-
Sometimes jail, the Aurora jail we went to, but most of the time it was an emergency room.
Now, we've heard a lot about body worn cameras that police officers wear.
Mhm.
Does an ambulance EMT, do you have body worn cameras?
No,
Have you seen some of the body worn camera footage from this night?
yes,
And was it accurate and fair from your perspective?
yes,
Did you actually see yourself on it doing your job?
yes,
Would it assist the jury for you to watch yourself doing your job so you could explain what's going on?
yeah.
I'm going to have the people pull up Exhibit 181. For the record, this is Sergeant Nunez's body worn camera. And if we could start at 22:57:24.
If I may, I of course have no objection to the witness describing what she did, but I just want to continue to avoid having witnesses describe what's happening in a video.
Yeah, I think I've tried to make it clear that if they're testifying based upon their memory, that's fine, but simply commenting on the video is not. So go ahead.
Sir, so Ms. Gonzalez, I just want you to tell the jury what you remember, and we're just using the video for you to explain what your job is. So if you don't remember something that you see, just let us know.
Okay.
Head is on, raise your hand, guys. Don't move your feet, don't do that.
So do you see yourself in this?
Yes,
And where are you?
I'm at the foot of the stretcher on the left.
And where's the? Okay. We have a laser pointer that might be helpful.
Oh,
Oh, here it is.
no. So,
I need to get my steps in.
All right, Ms. Gonzalez, why don't you show us where you are?
right there.
And for the record, you're pointing to a person on the left side of the video, sort of at the foot of the stretcher. Is that correct?
Yes,
And do you remember approximately what time you arrived?
I don't remember.
If you look at the top left corner of the video, do you see a timestamp there?
I do.
And what is that time?
10:57 p.m.
And so if you sort of go back from where you are at 10:57, how long do you think it took you to park, or Mr. Walker to park the ambulance for you to get out and get the stretcher and come to the scene where we see you now?
I don't know.
What's your best estimation?
A minute or two.
So a short time.
Yes.
All right. Can we continue to play, please?
I don't think it's a situation. You almost did a picture of all three of us.
Let's pause, please. Can you describe to the jury what you were doing as far as setting up the pram?
There are arm flaps on the side of the stretcher that we fold down to make it easier for the patient to be transferred onto the bed. I'm setting those down. I'm getting the seatbelts out of the way so they're not sitting on the seatbelts when we put them on the stretcher. Laying down the top part of the bed, the head of the bed, laying that flat, that sort of things.
And at that time that when you are bringing up the stretcher and you're setting it up, have you still not been briefed about what's going on at the scene?
I was not.
Were you given any information about the person that you were about to put on the pram?
No,
Speaking of that person that's on the ground, do you even have his name?
no.
Can you tell the jury what you saw or observed as far as the person that's on the ground?
All I saw was a person being restrained by police on the ground.
And what did that look like? Describe that for us.
There were multiple officers, I don't remember the number, restraining a patient face down, chest down on the grass.
Now, we have a left shoulder and a right shoulder, of course. When you say face down to the grass, were both shoulders on the grass? Was one a little more elevated than the other, if you can tell us?
Both were on the ground,
So from your observation, he was flat on the ground.
correct.
Now, could you tell at that point whether or not he was in medical distress?
I could not tell.
At that point, was he moving very much?
No,
At that point, was he making any sounds?
he was grunting. That's all I remember.
And based on you being an EMT basic, did that cause any concern for you, those sounds alone?
No, because he had multiple officers restraining him. So the grunting could have meant a lot of different things.
Without telling us what people were saying, were other people talking around him?
Yes.
No, you're okay. I got it.
Can you tell us, Ms. Gonzalez, what you're waiting for at this moment?
The next decision?
And typically after ketamine is administered into the shoulder, as an EMT basic, are you waiting to see whether or not it takes effect?
Correct.
And then after it takes effect, what is the next step that you do?
I wait for the patient to be placed on the stretcher and put the seatbelts and soft restraints on.
Are there different ways, once a patient is put on the pram or the gurney, that you will then put on the restraints?
Yes.
And what is that called?
What is what called?
Well, is there a position called a rock star?
Yes.
And what is that position?
It would be right hand up, left hand by your side.
And is there any reason to use that position over another position?
Whenever we sedate somebody, that's the position they're in.
And what is that? Why do you do that?
In case they come out of the sedation unexpectedly, it's possible they could become combative. So for the safety of the patient as well as the personnel involved, they are soft restrained.
And we don't want the patient rolling off the gurney, right?
Correct.
Okay. Can we play, please?
My back pops are working.
Hey, Dale, is Redford coming?
He's not coming because they just arrested that.
Okay, gotcha.
They
did?
They did. So, they're busy, so.
Okay.
I just need to let them know, because
Yeah.
there's no lieutenants. that was-
You can feel your, I'm contacted, we're walking down the street. See if I can leave. Possibly wait, we're gonna give it maybe another minute, it looks like it's starting to kick in, so that's ready. We'll go ahead and come.
Yeah. All right, brother? I'm sure. Are you okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Just, I'm physical.
All right. How's the
Situation's unfortunate.
He's just breathing.
So.
It
is.
Okay, let's go ahead and get him on his side.
Let's get him on the gurney first.
Okay, yeah.
Watch his head, head.
At this point, Ms. Gonzalez, what was the patient or the man who was lifted onto the gurney, what was his condition?
He was sedated.
And what does that mean?
He was unconscious.
Did you see any movement from him at all?
No.
Dale, he's out.
Okay. Good.
Hey, Woodyard.
Yeah.
So the Grandpas, they got
Back up, we'll go up, straight up.
Now, just a few moments ago, Ms. Gonzalez, did you see some fluid or vomit come out of the man on the gurney?
Yes.
At this point, as an EMT basic, what is,
Again, I'm going to remind council that if she remembers it, it's not what's shown on the video. If she remembers it, she can testify to it.
yes, sir. Thank you for for the reminder. Can you tell the jury what is going on medically with the person on the pram?
Medically, he's sedated. I did observe vomit on his face and his neck and his shirt.
At that point, did you have any concerns for his ability to breathe?
At that moment, no.
Did that develop?
Yes.
Tell us how.
When we got into the back of the ambulance and we checked his pulse, he didn't have one, and we realized he wasn't breathing.
Who was the person that checked who realized that he did not have a pulse?
I checked it and another firefighter checked it, I believe.
So once you realized that the man did not have a pulse, what did you do?
I started CPR.
What happened next?
I did a round of CPR and a round of CPR, doing CPR for 2 minutes straight. And then after my round was finished, I got out of the ambulance and drove us to the emergency room.
Now, I'm going to kind of direct your attention back to the time right as he's being, right before the ketamine shot. Do you remember hearing any of the firefighters talking to the officers about anything that had gone on with the man that was concerning?
I do not remember.
And do you remember whether or not the officers went to the paramedics and said, hey, there's been things going on that you need to know?
I don't remember.
As a paramedic, would it have been helpful to know, is it helpful to know some basic information before you give a sedative?
Yes.
What basic information is it helpful to know?
The reason for the sedative, the patient's estimated weight, if you can get the patient's allergies, that would be, medication allergies would be helpful as well. Sometimes you can't always get that, especially if they're not with it. They don't know what's going on. They're not oriented.
Sure. So coherency would be nice to know if a patient wasn't coherent.
Correct.
What about if a patient said, I can't breathe? Is that something a paramedic would want to know before they administer a drug like ketamine?
Yes.
Why?
Because a sedative could make the ability to breathe worse.
How about if that patient said, I can't breathe 5 or 6 or 7 times? Is the number of times they make that statement, would that increase your concern that that a sedative could maybe depress a patient's?
This is getting to be speculative, Your Honor.
I'll rephrase, it was a bad question.
I'll sustain the objection.
Hypothetically, if a patient indicates that they can't breathe multiple times, does that increase your concern?
It can.
Why?
And Your Honor, I'm going to object at this point under 702 and 703.
Sustained. She hasn't been qualified as an expert.
I'll move on. So we're back in the ambulance and you are doing CPR, is that correct?
Yes.
What happens next?
After I do my 2 minutes of CPR, I get out of the ambulance and I drive us to the ER.
And at that point, before you got out and drove to the hospital, what is the patient's condition?
He's in cardiac arrest.
What does that mean?
That means he doesn't have a pulse and he's not breathing.
This may seem like a silly question, but how serious is that?
Very.
And why is that serious?
Because it could be fatal.
You need a heartbeat, you need to be able to breathe,
Correct?
you need a pulse.
Yes.
Once you got to the ambulance, what happened next?
After when?
Once you got to sorry, bad question. Once you got to the hospital, what happened next?
Once we got to the hospital, we took him out of the ambulance. We made sure he was disconnected from the ambulance equipment and transferred him to our portable machines. And then we got him out of the ambulance and took him to the trauma room in the ER.
Did you transfer care at that point?
Yes.
I have no further questions at this time. Thank you very much, Ms. Gonzalez.
Cross-examination.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
But just to review a little bit, Ms. Gonzalez, you were called to the scene by Aurora Fire, is that right?
Correct.
Police officers didn't call you to the scene, right?
Correct,
Police officers didn't get on the radio and request ketamine, right?
correct.
I'm asking follow-up question to why she was called to the scene, which was asked by the prosecution.
Well, she could testify to which dispatchers dispatched, but not much more than that, so I'll allow that.
So we've established it was Aurora Fire who was asking for ketamine. Is it-
Over the radio, yes.
Are you aware? Did you hear anyone else ask you to respond in your ambulance with the ketamine that you and paramedic Walker brought on that night?
Not over the radio, no.
When you arrived, you saw that there were a lot of police cars, right?
Yes,
And there was a fire engine there, right?
yes,
That was Aurora Fire.
correct.
And there were several firefighters on scene, right?
Yes,
And the firefighters who were there are also medics, is that right?
some of them, yes.
So some of them on scene, and I wanted to understand this, some of those firefighters are EMTs and or paramedics, correct?
Correct,
And just so that it's clear, when somebody needs emergency care, oftentimes we'll see an ambulance come, right?
yes,
Or a fire truck, right?
yes,
And sometimes both, right?
correct.
Okay. And you and paramedic Walker sort of position the ambulance as close as you can, practically speaking, right?
Yes,
And you get out as is protocol with the stretcher, right?
yes,
And you recall there was sort of like a hill or a slope you had to carry it up, right?
yes,
Sort of several feet away, is that fair?
yes.
Okay. You couldn't get right up there because of all the sort of cars and everyone else who had already arrived. Is that correct?
There was a clear path from the back of the ambulance to next to the patient.
Oh, sure. I'm just talking about from where you had to park the ambulance.
Oh, yes,
Okay. And we see from the video that you and paramedic Walker were able to sort of get very close to the person who was on the ground with police and sort of join that sort of circle around him. Is that fair to say?
yes,
Okay. And observe him in the same position as the other Aurora Fire who were standing with him as well.
yes,
And you talked about the fact that there were multiple police officers restraining this individual at that point, right?
yes.
And you could hear him making a sound that you described as groaning. Did I remember that right?
Grunting.
Grunting, thank you.
Yes.
Grunting. And with your medical background or your medical training, hearing that sound and what you are seeing in conjunction or, standing with the other firefighters and police officers did not immediately cause you any concern. Is that right?
Yes,
Because you didn't have much information. Right.
correct.
There was nothing at that moment that required you or paramedic Walker or any of the other medics to sort of get down there and directly intervene that you could tell.
Not that I know of.
And then we see this moment, or you remember the moment where one of those medics is holding a syringe of ketamine. Do you remember that?
Yes,
He's kind of holding it up like this. Is that right?
yes,
And at that moment, there are not only officers standing or firefighters and officers standing around, right?
yes,
But there's still some police officers down on the ground with him, right?
correct.
And there's discussion about that injection that's going to be occurring, right?
I didn't hear any discussion about it.
Okay. Based on your training and experience and in terms of your role, who was making the decision about ketamine? Was it you, or do you know who made the decision?
It was not me. I do not know who brought up ketamine in the first place.
Okay. Was the decision for ketamine made prior to your arrival, or do you know?
Yes, it was.
Do you know who was holding it? Who was holding the syringe?
First, it was my partner, Ryan Walker, and then he handed it to Cooper.
And Cooper is Aurora Fire, is that right?
Yes,
And your team with Falk responds to work with Aurora Fire, correct?
correct.
And so if you're bringing that ketamine to Aurora Fire, you're giving it to them, right?
Correct.
You're not giving ketamine to any officer to make a decision about, is that right?
We do not hand medications to officers, no.
Nor can an officer direct you to administer a medication, correct?
Correct.
You were asked a couple questions about ketamine and you told us that you know it comes with a lot of protocols, right?
Not protocols, just symptoms.
I guess a better way to ask the question is, aren't there protocols for how to use it?
Yes,
Okay. And the protocols require that a patient is given a very close assessment before an injection like that. Would you agree with that?
I don't remember the exact protocol.
Okay. What about after an injection such as that? Isn't it the case that paramedics monitor a patient very closely?
If it is safe to do so, yes.
If it is safe to monitor them?
If it is safe to do it closely, if we are in the appropriate environment, if everything is controlled, then we are able to do so.
Okay. And there is equipment that you have in your possession that would allow you to monitor a patient, right?
In that instance or in general?
Both.
In that instance, I don't know where that equipment was, but in general, we do use that.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. In general, you have a way to take blood pressure, correct?
Yes,
And you have a way to take a heart rate, correct?
correct.
And you have a way to measure vital signs, right?
Yes,
And you have a way to do a pulse oximetry or test someone's oxygen level, right?
yes.
There's a way to test someone's saturation of oxygen, right?
That's the same thing,
Oh,
yes.
thank you. And there's a way to check someone's airway, right?
With equipment, no.
But you are trained to make sure someone's airway is clear.
Yes, yeah,
Okay. And in addition to that visual inspection, there are these other things that require more specialized equipment that you couldn't just do visually. Is that right?
correct.
And that's the kind of thing that you actually train, right?
Mhm.
You go to school to be an EMT, right?
Yes.
And the EMT training is 3 months, is that right? Or is it
The
longer?
program I was in, it was 3 months, yes.
And you've since become a paramedic, as I understand. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay. And that's additional training, correct?
correct.
And that's training to be able to recognize certain symptoms of someone who might be experiencing medical emergency, right?
Yes,
And certain ways to get the information that would tell you that if it's not apparent by looking at them, right?
right.
And that's essentially what those items are for, to ensure.
Yes,
And so here we have a situation where your partner fills the syringe with 500, is that right?
I think so, yes.
If you don't know, that's okay.
Yeah.
Hands it to another paramedic, I assume. Do you know if Mr. Cooper was a paramedic or?
He
what his
was,
role
yeah.
is? Okay. And somewhere along the line, this decision has been made and you watch the injection, correct?
Yes,
And there are 2 paramedics present from Falk, you and Mr. Walker.
and I was an EMT basic at the time.
Fair
yes.
enough. Who you have to keep that medication locked up, right?
Yes,
There, in addition to the things I've talked about with respect to assessing a patient, there's even protocols for how it's stored, right?
yes,
You have to have a license, right?
yes,
So there's only certain ambulances that have it, correct?
yes,
And so the people who are bringing that come with these sort of expectations and sort of a level of training, right? In terms of how it's stored and how it's to be used, right?
Yes.
And you're then told something by Aurora Fire and it's given to Aurora Fire, right?
Yes.
And that paramedic is right over this individual, right?
Yes.
And with you and Mr. Walker and Mr. Cooper and the other firefighters, while that syringe is up in the air, does anyone say, let's look at him before we inject him with ketamine? I'm talking about the paramedics in this instance.
I don't recall.
Because you were asked a lot of questions about whether you were given information about what might have occurred before you arrived. Do you remember Ms. Joyce asking you those questions?
I do.
And, you know, if someone had said 5, 6, 7 times that they couldn't breathe, that might be helpful information for a paramedic, right?
Yes.
And you also know that from your training that before you inject someone with a very heavy sedative, important information is something that the person giving it can also ask, right?
Yes.
So, you know, paramedics certainly are trained to try to get important information to aid in their treatment, correct?
Correct.
Right. So, you know, the people who have the training have a better sense of what kind of information they need to know, right?
Judge, I don't know if this witness knows that.
I'll sustain that objection.
If in your role as a paramedic, there was something that you thought you needed to know before you were going to engage in some course of treatment or administration of a medication, are there things that you are trained to look for?
So if I was a paramedic in this instance,
I'm just talking about now, not this, but just in your role now. If you are treating someone, are there signs or symptoms that you would look for before you administer a medication?
Sustained.
Did you or any other paramedic attempt to communicate with the person on the ground?
I personally didn't. I don't know if anybody else did.
Okay. Did you see anyone else attempt to examine or assess the person who was on the ground, to your knowledge?
To my knowledge, I don't know.
Okay. So that's before the medication. After the medication is administered, there's sort of a little bit of a waiting period for the medication to take effect. Did I understand that right?
Yes.
Okay. And that was, and I know you probably don't remember this long ago, but a couple minutes, or can you estimate how long you wait?
Couple minutes, I would say. I don't remember the exact amount of time.
Because you were asked questions about if someone is face down on the ground, it could impact their ability to keep their airway clear, right?
Correct.
And in this case, we see that this person was face down on the ground, right?
Correct.
And then he was injected with ketamine, right?
Yes.
And then he remained face down on the ground for that to take effect?
I don't remember the position he was in when we were waiting for it to take effect.
But certainly once a sedative is administered, it's particularly important to make sure someone can protect their airway.
Yes.
And after the medication took effect, a number of individuals lifted this person off of the ground onto the stretcher, right?
Yes.
The stretcher that you had brought, right?
Yes.
You don't know who they are, right?
No.
You don't know if this gentleman over here was part of that effort.
I don't remember.
Okay. And when Mr. McClain was put on the gurney, he went from being sort of slumped over because he was in a state of sedation, correct?
Correct.
And in that moment, with the people who were around him, including paramedics, there was substance leaking out of his mouth. Do you remember seeing that?
I do.
And that was a concern, right? Or no? Not at that time?
Not at that time.
And you didn't see any other medical professional comment on that or react to that, did you?
Not that I can remember.
Okay. And at this time, when Mr. McClain is on the gurney, that gurney is the possession of Falk, right?
Yes.
And you and others are now wheeling him into the ambulance, right?
Correct.
He is in the hands of paramedics, right?
Yes,
And as he's going back on the gurney, do you remember he sort of flops back? Do you remember that happening?
I do.
And you can see stuff was leaking out of him. And then when he flops back, you see it sort of spatter on his face, right?
I don't remember it spattering.
Okay. You can kind of still see it around his mouth as he goes back onto his back. Mhm. And now he's on his back, and there's this moment where he is fully unconscious, right?
Yes.
And we can see that there's substance pooling in his mouth, right?
I didn't look in his mouth.
Did anybody look in his mouth after he was unconscious in terms of medical personnel?
Not that I can remember.
But it appears that he is still breathing, right?
Yes,
You can see his chest rising and falling
correct.
with all the fluid that you noticed after he's unconscious, right?
Yes,
At that moment, no medical professional checks his pulse, right?
not that I can remember.
No medical professional tries to clear his airway or suction in that moment.
Right.
You have to literally walk him on the gurney back to the ambulance, right?
That's what we did next. Yes.
No. And it's not very far away, but
No.
several steps, right?
Yes.
Seconds, minutes, what would you think?
30 seconds or so.
30 seconds.
That's a guess.
Fine. That's perfectly fine. And then he is in you and Mr. Walker's ambulance, right?
Yes.
And at some time in there, you remember somebody saying, let's check a pulse, right?
Yes.
And you remember somebody saying, he doesn't have a pulse, right?
Right.
And in that moment, you are the first one who starts doing CPR, right?
Correct.
And the CPR, as you are trained, is continuous, right?
Correct.
2 minutes,
For our protocols, yes, 2 minutes.
and then somebody else takes over, right?
Yes.
And another continuous 2 minutes, right?
Depending on what our rhythm check says, yes.
And when you don't wait to start CPR. That's the first priority, is to start the breathing, pushes, if you will, right?
The compressions are to pump the heart, not for breathing.
Thank you. That's my lack of medical expertise.
There.
And then during CPR, you do want to make sure the airway is cleared, right?
Yes.
So as quickly as possible, there is a breathing sort of apparatus or two being placed into Mr. McClain's airway, right?
I don't remember. I think after I did my compressions, I got out. I don't remember what happened next.
Everything's happening very fast,
Yes.
right? Just one more question. You were asked a lot of questions about the officers. Do you remember those questions? Like, what were the officers doing?
Yes.
Can you tell us anything that you remember in those moments? Anything that this officer was doing with respect to Mr. McClain?
I don't remember.
Those moments,
Pardon me?
those moments, I think we can a little more, what's fine, what's talking about.
I agree. You can clean it up on your redirect as well.
Do you want me to clarify that, Your Honor? Was that an
No,
invitation
if
for
you're
me to-
stopping, I guess this is a good time to clear it up. Redirect.
Hello again, Ms. Gonzalez.
Hello.
I want to go back into the moment where they're lifting up the man that we know is Elijah McClain and putting him from the ground onto the stretcher. You're with me?
Yes.
All right. Would you say that it was a combined effort, a team effort between the firefighters and the police officers that got Mr. McClain from the ground onto the pram?
Yes.
And do you remember whether or not it was the police officers that were checking the straps at the bottom of the pram to make sure that Mr. McClain would stay on?
I don't remember.
And do you remember whether or not police officers were around Mr. McClain once he was put on the pram?
They were around, yes.
Thank you. I have nothing further.
May the, excuse me, may the witness be excused? May I step down? Folks, it looks like a pretty good time to take our afternoon halftime break. So don't form or express any opinions or discuss the case. Stay away from any media coverage. And I'd like to have you back in approximately 15 minutes. Jurors have stepped out. You may be seated if you wish, and we'll see you in 15 minutes. All right, if you'll please have a seat. Based upon the glass panels, you'll need to either speak somewhat loudly or close to the microphone to make sure everybody can hear you. And if you can tell us your first and last name and then spell your last name for my court reporter.
Brian Walker, Walker.
Your witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Walker, can you please explain to the jury what your occupation is?
What it is now or what it was at this time?
Both.
At the time, I was a paramedic for Falk Ambulance. Currently, I work as a firefighter paramedic for Arvada Fire.
Can you tell the jury a little bit about your career path that led you to that position as a paramedic with Falk Ambulance?
Yeah, so I went to EMT school. I don't remember exactly how long it was. After getting out of there, I started with Mile High Ambulance. I was there for about 2 months. Switched over to Rural Metro Ambulance. They had the contract for 911 calls in the city of Aurora. And I was there for a year and a half before switching to Falk. Falk won out the bid for the contract for 911 calls in Aurora. So I moved to Falk in 2015. They had a scholarship program. They put me through paramedic school, which is about a year of schooling. And then I worked for them as a paramedic.
When did you get that paramedic certification?
I believe it was May of 2019.
About 4 months or so before this incident?
Correct.
Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of the ambulance system. How does the relationship work, or how did it work at the time, the relationship between Falk Ambulance and Aurora Fire?
What do you mean about the relationship?
Yeah, so would you all go to the same calls?
Yes. The medical calls, they would dispatch an ambulance and one of Aurora Fire's engines.
What was the relationship like between you once you got to the scene? I guess who was making medical decisions?
When we got on scene, Aurora Fire had what was called medical control. So they were in charge of all the medical decisions and treatments.
Do you know anything about how the dispatch system worked that would get Falk Ambulance dispatched out to a scene?
Not specifics. I just know it was supposed to be the closest ambulance to the call would get dispatched.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the night of August 24th of 2019. Were you working that night?
Yes.
What was your job responsibility?
I was paramedic for Falk Ambulance.
Were you working with a partner or a team?
Yes, I had an EMT working with me on the ambulance,
Who was that?
Elisa Gonzalez.
Did you receive a call to go out to the Colfax and Billings area?
Yes.
Now, before you arrived, did you have any specific information about what you would be encountering there?
I don't remember what information I had.
Okay. Did you have an understanding that one of your roles that evening would be to provide ketamine?
While we were responding to the call, yes, we got that on the radio.
So I want to talk now about what happened when you very first showed up. When you and Miss Gonzalez show up with the Falk ambulance, what's the first thing that happens?
Just on any call or on that call specifically?
On this call.
When we got there, Aurora Fire was already on scene. And so we got out, had a quick conversation with Paramedic Cooper on what was going on and kind of where we were headed for the call treatment-wise.
Did one of the paramedics talk to you about drawing up some ketamine?
Yes, Paramedic Cooper.
At that point in time, did you know who the patient was?
No.
When the paramedics order ketamine from you, is there a back and forth procedure that you use to confirm what's being done?
I always make sure, state the medication, show the vial, which has the expiration date, and just reconfirm the dosage.
And how much dosage of ketamine was ordered up in this scenario?
500 milligrams.
No, I want to play for you Exhibit 184, Sergeant Leonard's camera, starting at 57 minutes and 46 seconds. I just want to make sure that we understand who your partner was. So if you see her, stop and figure that out.
He's drawing up Kennedy right now.
Okay.
You want to give that before we?
Yeah, so once he gets back, I'm gonna hit him in the right shoulder.
Want some shears?
You want shoulder or ass?
Either way. just-
Ass is right here, man.
Give that,
Do you see your partner on the screen there?
Yes, she is touching the head of the bed of our gurney.
Is this her that I've got highlighted in green?
That's correct.
These four fellows to the left, are these the fire folks?
Yes.
Now, let's pull up exhibit 181, Sergeant Nunez's camera at 22 hours, 58 minutes, and 46 seconds.
please take a look at the name.
I just told Redfern, we just brought it, let him know, so. I imagine this guy's not even going to jail tonight, based on his.
Who's that I'm highlighting with green there?
That's me.
Okay. What did you bring to the scene there?
That was the ketamine.
Okay. Did you give it to somebody?
Yes, to paramedic Cooper.
Okay. Now, is he the bald gentleman here?
Yes.
Is there another bald paramedic off on the right side of the scene?
I believe so.
Okay. Do you know who this fellow is?
I'm pretty sure that's Shakuniak. Okay.
The guy with the glasses on?
Yes.
All right. So I'd like to draw your attention to the timestamp because we're going to watch a little bit more of the video here. What's the timestamp for this video now?
22:58.
Is that 59? Oh, no, it is 58. You're right. Oh, no, it is 59. Your Honor, let the record reflect that the timestamp of the video is 59 minutes and 0 seconds. You may actually find it easier to watch the screen in front of you because it's not quite as washed out from the lighting up here. All right, let's start playing from here.
There's no way. You okay?
Yeah, I'm good. Everybody's good.
The Demas camera got broken in the middle of all that.
What are you doing here?
Watching as he administers the medication.
Okay. Why did you sort of move a little bit from where you were standing to this position here?
I'm not sure.
Were you trying to get a good view of the patient?
Possibly.
What is Mr. Cooper doing right now?
Administering the ketamine.
Sustained.
What does Mr. Cooper do?
What does he do?
Yeah.
He's a paramedic for Aurora Fire.
And did he administer ketamine on this evening?
Yes.
Now let's continue playing.
Do we know where,
We already talked to the RP, we got the
Woody's
RP.
camera is?
What's that?
Do we know where Woody's camera is?
Well, go ahead, if you guys are okay with this one.
Do you know where your camera is?
No,
Okay,
fine,
fine,
fine.
it's
somewhere by.
Oh, wait, somewhere down there? Okay,
It's right there.
okay.
I just-
Hey, Woodyard?
I think it's on.
Rosa,
Yeah.
here in a minute, once this medicine kicks in, we're gonna uncuff him, put him on the bed,
Okay,
and then we're gonna restrain him softly when he gets to bed.
all right, we got to go.
Where did you move to?
He gave me the syringe back and I went to place the needle in the sharps container
Okay. Where's that at?
in the ambulance.
Let's continue playing.
Are you okay? I got it.
Been asked a question. We're in a situation where we're showing the witness a video and then asking them what happened and asking them what they remember after they've just seen it on a video. I'm objecting to this format. It is an improper presentation of evidence.
Response.
Judge, the video is in evidence. The jury can consider both the video evidence themselves, as well as the witness's testimony about both their independent memory and also what they are seeing on the video as a percipient witness, they can add additional context to what is only partially shown on the video. For example,
Well,
this
they can add the additional context, but not narrate.
fair. All right. Just continue playing.
My back thought triggered it.
Hey, Dale, is Redford coming?
He's not coming because they just arrested that.
Ah,
inside us.
okay, gotcha.
They did?
They did. So, they're busy, so.
Okay.
Extra large, so. I just need to let them know that
Yeah.
there's no lieutenant. So
Even still, some contact go walking down the street. See if I can read it. Wait, we're gonna give it maybe like a minute, it looks like it's starting to kick in, so that's ready, but go ahead and come. It's you.
Yeah. All right, brother? Sure. Are you okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Just, I'm physically.
All right.
I would see the situation's a little frustrating.
He's just breathing.
So.
Now, what are you doing at this point in time?
Looks like I'm trying to look at the patient.
I'd like to talk about your observations of the patient between 59 minutes and now 00:58. So I guess about the last 2 minutes, is that fair?
Yes.
How many officers are restraining the patient during this time?
I'm not sure the exact amount.
Can you describe how the officers were restraining the patient?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
But just from your recollection of what you were able to see at the scene, how were the officers restraining the patient?
Just by being on top of him, I guess.
Okay. Were they kneeling on him?
I cannot tell.
Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about your perceptions of what else was happening there. Was the patient handcuffed?
I could not tell at that time.
Now, in the course of work and after this incident, did you prepare an incident report related to this?
A patient care report we do on every call.
Okay. And the purpose of that call or that report is that to try and document things that are fresh in your mind?
Just document everything that occurred.
Okay. And when was that report prepared relative to this incident?
I'm not exactly sure what time I completed the report.
Would it have been within hours or a few days of this happening?
It would have been by the end of my shift.
Okay, so the same night?
Yes.
Could we please show just to the witness the incident, the patient care report, excuse me, and specifically drawing your attention to the first paragraph on page 6. Now, is this your narrative of what happened that night, sir?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And in your narrative, do you say that the approximately 30-year-old male, prone on the ground, in the grass, just next to a sidewalk, with handcuffs behind his back on, and at least 3 APD officers on top of PT dot, is that patient?
That is patient.
On top of patient, completely physically restraining him. Is that an accurate or is that an accurate reading of what was in your narrative report that you wrote that night?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Now, I'd like to talk to you about, we can take that down. Thanks, Mr. Campos. Now, when you arrived on that scene, especially during that 2 minutes that we're just talking about there, did it look to you like the patient was fighting the police?
I wasn't able to fully see the patient.
From what you were able to see, did it look like he was fighting the police? From what you were able to see, did it look like the patient was able to move?
Not from what I could see.
From what you could see, why couldn't he move?
Because he was being restrained.
Now let's resume playing the next 45 seconds of that video.
Okay, then get him on his side.
Let's get him on the feet first.
Okay.
Okay.
Watch his head. Head. Dale, he's out.
Okay. Good.
Hey, Woodyard.
Yeah.
So you grab this. I got it.
During the last 45 seconds, do you remember seeing the patient fighting at all with officers?
No.
Which group of people moved the patient from his position on the ground up onto the gurney?
It was both Aurora Fire and police.
Okay. And the individual in the middle there, his fellow officers, were they the ones restraining him on the ground?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
This gentleman in the middle, one of the ones that was restraining him on the ground?
Yes.
I don't have any further questions for you. Thank you.
Cross-exam.
Hi, Mr. Walker.
Hey.
We're referring to this young man we now know is Elijah McClain as the patient. Why do you refer to him as the patient?
In my report or just,
In your practice?
I'm not sure how to answer that.
Well, was he your patient?
Yes,
And you said that Aurora Fire had medical control, right?
correct.
So he's your patient or he's their patient or both?
Both.
So when they have medical control, what does that mean?
It means that they make the final decisions on treatments.
They do, okay. And then when you still are treating a patient in connection with another agency, how does that work?
As far as back with Falk and Aurora Fire.
Yeah,
Is that what you mean? I mean, I could have suggestions or, try to help out with the treatments and stuff, but when the final decision is Aurora Fire.
okay. And so that's what I wanted to understand is that when a decision is made, were you sort of deferring to Aurora Fire in this instance?
I don't know what you mean on that.
Well, when the decision was made to give ketamine,
Mhm.
was that your decision?
No.
Okay. That decision had been made by Aurora Fire, as far as you understood.
Yes, by their assessments.
Okay. And so when you provided the ketamine, you weren't involved in that decision making. Is that correct?
Correct.
And so in that sense, what I'm asking is, were you sort of deferring, because you're providing the ketamine, right?
Yes.
So when I say deferring, you're sort of letting them have the say about that, whether to administer it.
Yes.
And you are trained on ketamine, is that right?
Correct.
And the risks of ketamine, right? And you know that the administration of ketamine requires a very careful assessment, is that right?
Response.
This is cross-examination. He was asked questions about bringing ketamine to the scene. That's his role in the case.
All right, well, he hasn't been qualified as an expert in ketamine, so sustain.
When With respect to Aurora Fire having made this decision, did you perform any assessments on Mr. McClain?
Not prior to the administration,
And why not?
because they had performed an assessment already.
Okay, they had performed an assessment already?
Yeah.
Okay. Your Honor, may we approach just briefly?
Okay.
Okay, so in terms of what occurred, Aurora Fire, in your mind, had done the proper assessment, right?
Yes,
And you drew up the amount of ketamine that was requested, correct?
correct.
You provided that syringe to Aurora Fire, to a certain paramedic, right?
Yes,
And no further assessment was conducted at that point by anyone in terms of what you observed after providing the ketamine.
at that time, or?
Yes,
what
sir.
do you mean? Correct.
And then after the ketamine was injected into Mr. McClain, was there an assessment performed to monitor him immediately after the injection?
Once we got into the ambulance, yes.
And so between the transport and the ambulance, there was no monitoring equipment or anything of that nature.
Correct.
You noticed that he still had a pulse, right?
Yes.
Did you actually take his pulse?
I did not, I can't remember who did.
Okay. But you could see that he was breathing.
Yes,
And clarify, while you are transporting him on the gurney from where you've encountered him to the ambulance, to clarify, you were walking with him and pushing the gurney to the ambulance, is that right?
correct,
And you were maintaining an observation of him, right?
correct.
At that point, that was sort of your role, is you are monitoring the patient, at least visually, correct?
Yes,
And you were very intentionally making sure that you could see him breathing, right?
correct.
And you did see that his chest was rising and falling, right?
Yes,
Even though he was unconscious, right?
Yeah.
And when you got to the ambulance, you did notice that his airway was compromised, right?
I'm sorry, what are you asking?
When you got to the ambulance, either upon putting him in the ambulance or inside the ambulance, you noticed that his airway was compromised due to saliva and emesis. Do you remember that?
Yes,
And that was a pretty big red flag, right?
yes,
Because he was unconscious, right?
correct.
And he then required continued suctioning in the ambulance, right?
Yes,
Once that was noticed.
correct.
Could just have one moment. Thank you, Mr. Walker. That's all I have, Your Honor.
Redirect.
Mr. Walker, the defense asked you about control of the scene, and you mentioned that Aurora Fire and Rescue has ultimate medical decision-making control. Is that right?
Correct.
On the scene, who makes the decisions about whether somebody is handcuffed or not?
That would be the police.
Who makes decisions about whether somebody is restrained?
And it depends on the call.
Good point. can you tell the jury the difference there, or how that interacts between the police and medical decision on restraints?
As far as medically, restraining somebody if they're a harm to themselves or others, or the EMS professionals.
So, I guess to be more specific, prior to Mr. McClain being placed on the gurney, who was making the decisions on how he was restrained?
I'm not sure. I wasn't there at that point.
Fair enough. The defense asked you whether you'd performed any assessments on Mr. McClain prior to the administration of ketamine. You said that no, that the Aurora Fire Rescue had already performed an assessment. Did you see them do that?
No, that was spoken to me by Paramedic Cooper.
Okay. So were you relying on the information that they gave you about Mr. McClain's medical
Academy?
Yes.
So if we can zoom, actually, so I see here, total techniques 5, minimum standard 100%. What does that mean?
So it is a pass-fail test. Typically, practical tests will have a pass, pin, fail grading criteria. Anyway, the pass-fail though is strictly for the carotid because it is such a high liability thing. We'll make sure people are.
So when you say pass fail, it's not like a 51% I passed, underneath that I failed. What is that for this particular exam?
The pass is that they were able to complete the practical portion of the carotid to standards that we have set forth for the academy, which is, I could see that they're doing a technique correctly. They're applying it correctly, all that stuff that they learned.
So is that why it says 100%? It's not, you need to get 100% correct
Yes.
to pass? Okay.
Yes.
So now I want to focus on the bottom section. Can you tell us, is that like whose signature is that for the instructor?
That is mine.
Okay. And do you recognize your own signature and your employee number?
Yes.
Okay. So can you tell us what is the boxes above your name, the carotid hold, and then the 5?
Carotid hold, of course, is the technique. And then there's specific things that we look for during test out. Do you want me to go through each one?
We will do that. I just wanted to know that, are those the 5 things that a recruit would have to pass?
Yes.
What would happen if a recruit failed?
They would be remediated.
Okay.
And then retested at a later date.
Okay. Are you aware, as an instructor at the 2016 APD Academy, were there any other classes that were this 100% pass-fail?
All classes that take this particular test are pass-fail.
So just the carotid particular exam is the pass-fail at 100%?
Yes.
Is there any other examinations that you would do like this that are that 100% standard?
No.
So this is a uniquely high standard for this test?
Yes.
Were all the recruits in 2016 semester 2 tested the same way?
Yes.
Was that important to the academy?
Yes.
And why is that?
To ensure that everybody's meeting the proper standard to apply if needed.
Okay. So here we just see kind of 5 broad categories. Was there anything that were provided to the instructors testing recruits to know what it is that you were looking for that carotid control hold, for that subject gives up, each of those things?
Yeah, each instructor that has the authorization or the green light to actually test the carotid has to undergo instruction themselves at another level course, an instructor level course, and properly pass those techniques at that instructor level course. And then they are certified to then assist with teaching basic recruits and testing out basic recruits.
Okay, so not even like all the instructors at APD Academy would be able to test recruits on this method?
They would have to be certified. So not everybody was.
Okay. And so when you are watching recruits doing this particular examination, do you have any kind of checklist that you're looking at to determine whether they are doing each of these in the same manner that all the other recruits are expected to do?
There is a training outline that is used for both in-services and basic recruit classes. Depending on the level of instructor and how long they've been doing it, they may or may not have to look at that sheet, but they're all the recruits are actually taught, I guess, that with that curriculum, with that lesson plan. But during test out, it may not necessarily be in front of them.
Sure. But when you are looking at a recruit completing this examination, you have almost like a check mark. You're doing this first, then this second, and then this third.
Roughly, yeah. Look here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So can we take this down? Mr. Campos, thank you. And at this time, the people would request permission to show just this witness, People's Exhibit 224.
You may.
Thank you. And it should. Officer Heineman, do you recognize what is on the screen in front of you?
Yes.
What is it?
This is the sheet I was talking about on how to, it basically starts at a very low level and kind of progresses through to other components of the carotid control hold.
And how do you know that is what this is?
I've used it.
Okay. And is it a fair and accurate copy of that carotid practical list you were talking about?
Yes.
Okay. At this time, the people would move to admit Exhibit 224.
Questions or objections? 224 may be admitted.
Yeah. So at this time, the people would also request permission to publish. Oh, I hope you. Thank you. So Officer Heineman, can you explain just at a higher level before we actually zoom in, what is it that we are generally looking at here?
It's basically kind of like a lesson plan, if you will, on how to properly apply the carotid, and it gives specific instruction on kind of how many times to do each technique on most of it. Yeah, it's a bird's eye view.
And is this practical list very kind of applicable to the 5 sections we were just looking at on that carotid examination?
Yes.
Okay. And is this to make sure that the testing is standard between each recruit?
Yes.
Okay, so starting, I think, at that first section, from body positioning all the way down to where it says break. Actually, before we actually get into this, can we talk a little bit about what the process was like to give the carotid exam, like the practical exam? I think you mentioned there were 10 recruits at most per one instructor. So what was that looking like? Was everyone in uniform, out of uniform, in a gym, outside? Can you tell us what that would have looked like?
For this particular class, I don't recall exact venue, but usually it occurs in the arrest control room, multi-use bay, if you will, of the Police Training Academy. We have mats down. Instructors are in their instructor uniforms. Recruits are in their recruit attire, typically a skills gear, BDU pants, and skills shirt type thing. Sometimes a t-shirt. I don't recall what they were wearing exactly, but.
How long does each examination take per recruit?
That depends on how well the recruit's doing, how versed they are in the technique, and sometimes we have to remediate and come back later and test. So it just depends on the recruit.
Okay. Does each recruit kind of go one at a time? And so you're only watching one recruit at a time?
Yes.
Is it, I guess, like a very controlled process, a very controlled setting?
Yes.
Okay, so now we can take a look at that first section. And actually, I'm wondering, Mr. Campos, if we can have both of the first page of that exhibit and then the first page of exhibit 278 as well, just so we can see that. Thank you. Okay. So for this first section that we have, the body positioning, arm positioning, hand positioning, all of these things, is that associated with one particular section on the carotid control examination?
Yeah, that's just the carotid control hold itself, the line underneath the subheading carotid control. Carotid control hold covers a lot of that.
So it looks like this is a lot about how your physical body is actually supposed to look.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so body positioning, you expect to see the recruit on their knees behind a suspect, with their toes curled under, knees tight to what is that? I guess sus hips.
Yeah, suspect hips. Yeah. Mhm.
So what would it mean for a person to get 100% pass? Do they get like any freebies? Do they have to do every single one accurately to kind of that letter?
Yeah, to that letter.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it looks like for body positioning, arm positioning, hand positioning, a lot of those are these partner exams.
Some of it, they're working with a partner, and some of it, they're actual pressure applied to the neck. They would be working with a dummy, if you will, and yeah, that we provide.
So I see the first 4 sections, they're not about pressure. So is that all with another officer?
Yeah, that's strictly proper positioning of the arm and hand and body.
Okay. But then if you, and I guess you have to test the pressure in this controlled setting, you would still use a dummy.
Yes.
Okay. Is there a particular reason for that?
One could go out pretty quick with a bilateral vascular neck or the carotid control hold. They can very quickly with pressure be rendered unconscious. So we don't want to do that to recruits.
So looking then at on our right side, exhibit 278, did Nathan Woodyard as a recruit pass this first section of the carotid hold?
Yes.
So now I want to move to the second section of the carotid hold test. So Mr. Campos, if we could go back, yeah. And it looks like that part is just called suspect giving up or gives up. Is that just that first like de-escalation looking top section?
Yes.
Okay. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that is supposed to look like in this training? Does a recruit work with another recruit?
Yes.
Okay. And how would you show a suspect giving up in this training?
During the training, we obviously teach verbal commands, and then the recruit that is having the hold applied to them without pressure puts their hands in the air like they're surrendering to the use of force and complying now with orders. So de-escalation, and then the recruit that's being tested will apply a rear wrist lock, which is a cuffing position, and place handcuffs on the suspect.
So it's so did officer, or sorry, at this time, recruit Woodyard pass this suspect gives up, understanding this section of what to do when a suspect gives up?
Yes.
The next section, chancery. I need you to forgive my ignorance. I do not know what chancery means.
Chancery is a carotid hold. It's just a more secure carotid hold. It's not any more. It's not stronger necessarily. It's just it's harder to defeat because of hand positioning.
Okay, so I recognize this comes after the suspect gives up and then you move into chancery. How does that work on that test, like in the room?
Typically what will happen is we'll have the recruit that is having the application of on them give up, and then, okay, now fight again. And so the suspect or the suspect recruit, if you will begin to struggle again. And so the officer will apply the chancery, or the recruit will apply the chancery on their partner and show knowledge of that, proficiency with that technique.
So with the chancery and your recruit suspect is now fighting back, is your recruit suspect in any kind of like restraints, anything that has happened as part of this test if they've given up and you did that rear?
Typically it's in the process of cuffing or something like that. And now the recruit has to abandon their handcuffs and go into the hold again to, properly apply it again, I guess.
Okay, so it's almost like a little process. I mean, it's like a little play where you're pretending.
Role playing.
Role play.
Yeah.
That's a better word for that. Okay. So looking at recruit Woodyard's specific examination, did he pass that particular part of the examination?
Yes.
So next I want to look at that follow-up procedures section. Okay. So what are you expecting to see from recruits to successfully pass this portion of the test? Is this in a particular order for you to look at?
Yes, yeah, the order is important.
Okay. And what is, can you talk us through what it is that we should expect to see, or you would expect to see in the academy with review, take pressure off neck, and so on?
Taking the pressure off the neck is just that. We're taking the pressure off the neck. Once we get the desired outcome, whether it's being rendered unconscious or not, I'm not quite sure. That might, yeah, that might be the instructor notes saying review this with recruits more than likely. So no, that doesn't have, at least to my knowledge, any meaning as to what the follows would be.
Okay. Okay, so I think I interrupted you when you were talking about taking pressure off the neck, gain prone control, and cuff.
Yes, so
look for in a recruit during that part of the follow-up.
yeah, once the suspect gives up or is rendered unconscious, we need to see that the recruit completely takes their arm off of the neck and around the neck. And then from there, they gain a cuffing position, which is prone control in this instance. And then they cuff the suspect, or recruit trainee, once that happens.
Okay. So next is lay them on their side, parentheses, recovery position. For the purposes of the carotid hold test, what is the recovery position?
Recovery position is on your side to help maintain an open airway, aspiration of fluids, and all that other stuff. Don't go back into the throat. And it's the best possible. Well, it's a good position to be able to properly breathe in.
So when you say being on your side, is that like, so if this is the ground, are you on like a T?
Yeah, pretty much.
90-degree angle?
Yes.
Okay. Do you teach that a seated position is also a recovery position?
In this instance, if they are rendered unconscious, we will keep them on their side. And then if they come to, we can teach if they would rather sit up. We kind of let it up to the suspect at this point. Yeah, I want to sit up or whatever that looks like. We do say that that's okay. But typically it is on the side if they are rendered unconscious. If they're not rendered unconscious, again, we're going to keep them on their side, and then we're going to continually monitor and see how they're feeling, and then.
Okay, so even if your recruit suspect is not rendered unconscious in this examination, you still have them on a recovery position?
Yes.
Okay. Is being prone on your stomach considered recovery position for the purposes of the follow-up test?
No.
So can you talk to us about what it means to check vitals, breathing and pulse during this test?
Yeah, it's just that we teach the hand close to the mouth. We also check ventilation, mechanical ventilation. So rise and fall of the chest and back, see if we can see that. We also teach checking pulse at the radial pulse here, and not the neck, because that's the artery that was stimulated during the technique. So we stay away from that.
Okay. If the suspect recruit, if that person is still moving around on the ground, are you still expected to check vitals, breathing, and pulse?
If they're conscious and coherent and actually talking to us, it's probably not needed. So
talk to us about that call for rescue. What is the expectation at the academy class?
Getting onto the radio while we are checking vitals and calling for rescue. So calling for paramedics to come on scene. It's typically, send the fire department for an unconscious party, or, if not unconscious, just giving details on that so they know what they're responding to.
So if a suspect recruit was rendered unconscious, obviously it's a role play thing, is the expectation that you're calling for rescue and saying so-and-so is unconscious?
Yes.
If a person is not rendered unconscious, what are you expected to say?
Semi-rescue that needs to be checked.
Do you update, or is it a requirement to update for specifically like I did a carotid or if this person is not unconscious or anything like that?
You can, yeah.
I guess what is required for the test?
That's not necessarily required that we say we applied the carotid, but it's typically just send us rescue hot for an unconscious party is typically what we say.
Okay. So next up we have check for coherency. What would that look like in the academy setting?
Coherency is being able to answer questions and have some sort of dialogue between the two of you, I guess, in a way. I'm not a medical expert, but the things that we teach with the coherency thing is, hey, are you okay? How many quarters on $1.50 type stuff? Who's the president of the United States? Are they, answering questions appropriately?
So the check for coherency is you are directly talking to the recruit suspect?
Yes.
Okay. And then first aid, if necessary, seems pretty obvious to me, but I want to confirm, what would that look like at the recruit stage?
At the recruit stage, in officer stage in general, would be CPR. So say we don't get a pulse or whatever, we'll roll them to their back and begin CPR compressions.
Okay, so for these, many of these things, they'll lay them on their side, check vitals, call for rescue, check for coherency, and first aid if necessary. About how long of a process of test is that? Like, are you watching them do that for 5 minutes, 30 seconds, 10 minutes? What does that kind of look like?
So yeah, it's going to vary, but if the recruit gets all of the information out right away, knows exactly what they have to do, we don't require them to stay there for 5 minutes and monitor, for instance, or stay there and continue to check for pulse. What they usually do is reach down, they find the radial pulse, they say, I have found the pulse, stuff like that. But yeah, it goes by pretty quick, that portion.
So I guess, is the test not completed until they complete all of those things?
On the testing form on the bottom?
Yeah.
Yeah, yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so they wouldn't be able to walk away until they're done with the first aid if necessary, search and notify? Yes. So looking at Exhibit 278, at the time that Mr. Woodyard was a recruit, did he have the knowledge for there's a fifth one, sorry. Let's talk about the carotid in prone. What is that?
If somebody is in the prone position and I'm sorry.
No, I think that we might have that second page, so we can make that a little bit bigger.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
So can you tell us what is carotid in prone?
You'd have to go back to the first page, but I can tell you.
Oh.
It's basically the prone position. If we teach them, if they find themselves in a struggle where they're, and we call it a rear mount position.
The what position?
A rear mount position. It's a ground position that we teach. There's 4 different positions, and that's one of them. But if they find themselves in the rear mount of the suspect, and they can articulate the need to move to the carotid restraint, we show them how to do that from that position. So the suspect would be on their stomach, laying down, officer on their back in the rear mount position. So that's kind of how it looks.
Okay, so I guess what is the purpose of that section after the follow-up procedure?
Can you please go back?
Well, I guess I'm just looking at the just the 5-section carotid hold. Why does it come after follow-up procedure?
It's kind of a standalone thing. We just want to know that they can apply it. The follow-ups don't change. If somebody goes out and is rendered unconscious, from the prone position, but it's just they're showing their proficiency in that particular technique. So that wouldn't be part of like a, you know, if somebody was in a seated position, for instance, that'd be something separate.
So you having given this particular examination to, at that time, recruit Woodyard, you passed him in all 5 of these sections?
Yes,
And so, based on this examination, he had knowledge of all 5 of those sections, the control hold, suspect giving up, chancery, and all the follow-up procedures.
yes.
May I have one moment?
Yes.
That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Cross-examination.
Good afternoon, sir.
Afternoon.
Friday afternoon. Let me see if we can try to make this riveting. Sir, if I understand it correctly, you were not the instructor. You didn't lead the lecture for this, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. You were there for Mr. Woodyard to see if he passed the, I think you called it the practicum?
The practical test, yes.
Practical.
Mhm.
Okay. As I'm reminded every time I look in the mirror, college and law school gets further and further away from me. So it's been a while since I took a test. Typically speaking, before a test, in the lecture, they train you, they teach you what to learn and what to look for in the test. Is that fair?
Yes,
Is that what happens here with the carotid lecture?
yes.
Okay. Now, in terms of the lecture itself, is this a script or an interactive Q&A situation?
It's a PowerPoint, and so there's different topics discussed throughout the PowerPoint, and it is open for questions and open dialogue at times. So, yeah.
And if I understand it correctly, since you weren't there for the lecture, you're not exactly sure what was said to the recruits before the test.
Exactly, no,
You don't know what questions were asked.
no,
You don't know what reasoning was given for each step.
no.
Now, as I understand it, with there being a lecture and a test, is this sanctioned by the Aurora Police Department?
Yes,
So is it fair to say that the carotid hold then is a maneuver that is sanctioned and approved by the Aurora Police Department?
yes,
It is a approved and sanctioned maneuver by the Aurora Police Department that they teach their recruits.
yes,
And in fact, unless if you are able to pass a test, you cannot, I guess, continue working for the Aurora Police Department.
yes,
And so not only is it authorized and approved, it is one that is closely monitored and suggested to be used in appropriate situations.
yes.
Now, again, focusing on your role here, the test section. You had said that it's in the multi-use room. I forget the term you used.
That's how you use Bay. It's,
I envision like a blue mat with recruits around.
yeah, we lay blue mats down. Yes,
Now that's a controlled environment, right?
yes,
And one of the things that recruits are taught is that, look, in controlled environments, that's one thing, but when you're outside in the real world, we can't account for everything that could potentially occur.
yes,
And so when we're talking about a test, this is a situation where you try to simulate certain environmental, let's say, impacts, but you can't account for everything.
that's correct.
And the recruits are aware of this.
That's correct.
And so the test really goes over the best case scenario.
Yes,
In terms of the testing and the lectures, you are training recruits to be critical thinkers. Is that fair?
yes,
You are not training robots.
yes.
You
That's-
don't, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's correct. Sorry.
You don't expect them to just simply have a checklist. You want them to understand the reasoning for each maneuver.
That's correct.
And you want them to use and exercise their judgment on when a maneuver is appropriate.
I'll allow a bit of leeway, so go ahead.
Would you like me to repeat that, sir?
Yes, please.
Yes. You want the recruits and the human beings you're training to be able to utilize their discretion on when to use a maneuver.
Yes,
This maneuver is taught in order to ensure officer safety.
Outside the scope and.
I'll allow it.
Thank you. Would you like me to repeat that?
please.
This maneuver, this authorized maneuver by the Aurora Police Department is taught to recruits for officer safety purposes,
Yes,
to keep them safe out in the real world.
yes.
If, Mr. McCray, if we could have the, Your Honor, if we could have the screen, Mr. McCray, if you could put up People's Exhibit 224 and zoom in on the section of body positioning. And Your Honor, if we could publish. So I want to focus real briefly on body positioning and what you're looking for in terms of the test. Recruits are taught not to use the carotid on a suspect who is standing.
That's correct.
The danger there being that they could fall and injure themselves.
Yes,
So the carotid is taught to the recruits to be on the ground.
yes,
You are then also taught the best position to apply the carotid.
yes,
And the best position is to be directly behind the suspect, sort of on their back.
yes,
Now, let's talk about arm positioning. We've heard different terms throughout this trial. Some people use the term choke hold. Some people use the term carotid hold. When you hear that, does it kind of cringe you a little bit
the,
if I call this a choke hold?
it does.
Why?
It's incorrect terminology for what we're trying to do.
Okay. Are those two different maneuvers?
Yes,
Is the appropriate term a carotid control hold?
yes,
Now, we've also had witnesses attempt to demonstrate the carotid hold. Is this the appropriate maneuver for a carotid hold?
with the hand, no.
In this scenario, is there potential for damage to the trachea?
Yes, well, not specifically the trachea, but other soft structures at the front of the neck. Yeah,
If a recruit was to come to this test after going through the lecture and you're instructing them to show you the carotid hold and they go like this to the other individual, is that a pass or is that a fail?
that would be a fail.
Is the carotid hold using a arm where you protect the front of the neck with the crook of your arm?
Yes,
Now, moving to the section of arm positioning, if I could direct your attention to the first sentence, notice armpit location on shoulder for proper alignment. Is this teaching the recruits how best to position themselves when putting the arm around the neck and protecting the trachea and the other soft structures?
yes.
I then see R/L times 3. Can you explain to me what that means?
R stands for right, L stands for left, and times 3 means the number of repetitions on each side that we're supposed to have the student do the technique.
So if I understand it correctly, you are having the students put on the carotid 3 times on each side, or excuse me, so 6 times total.
Yes,
Do you tell the students, once you do it once, walk away, we're done for the day?
no,
So the recruits are literally being trained, do it 6 times, make sure you're doing it correctly,
yes, and more if needed.
and more if needed. Okay. With the right and left, is that because sometimes if you are on the field and you're not able to appropriately line up your shoulder with your right arm, your left arm might be a better position?
That's correct.
And so are the recruits then taught that if you are attempting with the right, before you put any pressure on, you can abandon it and move it to the left?
Yes,
Once again, the notice armpit location on shoulder for proper alignment. Can you tell us, is that sort of a, I guess, a focal point or something you're teaching the recruits in terms of this is how you know you're in the right position?
That's one of the checkpoints. Obviously, the elbow is also important.
Checkpoint. Thank you. That was the
Yeah.
succinct term that I was looking for. Okay. Now I see here in terms of arm positioning, hand positioning with pressure on dummy. So the recruits are being taught, or I guess during the test, they're applying this maneuver multiple times
Yes.
without pressure until we get to the dummy.
Yes.
Now with the dummy, what I see is right arm with pressure, hold for 15 seconds. And then immediately after, left arm with pressure, hold for 6 seconds. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. And this is all in the same test, or do you tell them, take a break, you're done for the day? After one arm, do you tell them to abandon, take a break, you're done for the day, and we'll try the left one next time?
No.
When recruits are attempting to apply the carotid, do you teach them, or is it part of the test, not to apply pressure until they have proper position?
Yes.
So if a recruit is attempting to apply a carotid but can't get in position, they're allowed to then switch and maybe try with their left arm.
Yes.
And if the left arm is successful, they're then taught by the Aurora Police Department that they can then apply pressure.
Yes.
That is approved and sanctioned by the Aurora Police Department. Did I get that accurate?
Yes.
Can we go down to Chancery? You were asked questions on direct about Chancery, and you had mentioned that you're going through a couple steps, and then the instructor would say, "Now fight," to the I guess, suspect?
Actor.
Actor.
Suspect actor. I don't know.
All right. And usually you tell that actor to fight right around the time the officer, the recruit, is trying to handcuff them.
That varies, but yeah, I mean, usually when the cuffs come out is when we may say, okay, fight, and then move into that.
Can you walk me through those steps? What happens before you say now fight?
Well, the role player, if you will, has been given direction to comply, and during their arrest, if you will, I then instruct, or an instructor instructs the recruit to then resist again.
So you said resist again. When do they resist at first?
That would have been, I guess it's assumed in the role playing scenario that the recruit or the suspect is resisting. Is it the level of resistance? Obviously, it just kind of depends. Sometimes there's no resistance in the training necessarily, but the application is what we're trying to test here is, can they get it on correctly? So we're looking at all these checkpoints, making sure that everything's appropriate and squared away.
Sure. So if I understand correctly, then in terms of, obviously there's different type of role play situations that you guys go through. In this type of scenario that we're talking about here, you have the suspect resist, he then gives up, he or she then gives up, and the officer then attempts to put on handcuffs. That's when you say, now fight again.
Roughly that time, yes.
Is this part of the test? Is this just pure carotid, or when the suspect is initially resisting, do you have the officer do anything to gain compliance?
Well, the application of the carotid itself, and then orders, verbal commands, and things like that.
So am I hearing you correctly that in this training, the Chancery, you have a resisting suspect or a resisting actor. The recruit then positions himself or herself for the carotid, and then the suspect gives up?
No, the actual application of the carotid. We gotta see that they can actually apply the carotid. If you pull the test back up, that first line where it says carotid, I gotta see that they have all the things are lined up per body positioning, arm positioning, hand positioning. We're checking to make sure that they're in the appropriate position. And actually applying. Is the role player necessarily resisting at a level? Not necessarily. This is a test out to make sure that everything is where it needs to be and that they can actually apply this appropriately.
And then in this scenario, the actor then pretends to give up.
Mhm.
The officer then begins to handcuff them, and then an instructor may say, now fight again.
Yes, during the chancery portion, yeah.
And then in that portion, does the officer line up again? Or is that what you're looking for?
He'll reapply. We make sure that, yeah, I mean, he has to still, or she has to get into the proper body position again, has to get to where they need to be. So that way the elbows in line with the sternum and the shoulders roughly around the shoulder and everything's in line. We got to see it safe, and then they can start to apply the chancery at that point.
I see. Okay. And I apologize, my coffee's wearing off. It's Friday.
Okay.
So if I understand correctly, it's resisting actor, do the carotid maneuver, make sure everything's lined up. Suspect is giving up. Okay, we'll move towards handcuffs. Now fight again, and then we start the chancery.
That's correct.
Perfect. We can move down to follow-ups, please, Mr. McCray. Right there. Yep. Once the carotid is applied, that is when the recruits are to put them, the actor on their side, known as the recovery position. Is that right?
Once the role player shows that they've went unconscious, so we'll have the role player kind of go limp and kind of pretend like they pass out. That is when the pressures has taken off the neck. They're rolled to prone position and cuffed.
Now, you mentioned, you're asked some questions about checking a pulse. You said that they're not supposed to check on the neck. You mentioned the wrist, right? And so in a real world application, if there's an officer by the head and there's an officer by the handcuffs where the hands are, who would be checking the pulse?
Your Honor, to outside.
I'll allow the witness to answer if he knows.
Thank you, Your Honor.
I guess that depends. The logical answer, I guess, is whoever's closest. But if that unable to do so for whatever reason, I mean, roles can change. So to say definitely that person, I'd be amiss to say that.
Yeah. In other words, we're not in a controlled environment anymore in this hypothetical, correct? Things
Yes,
change.
that's correct.
There could be an officer that's hurt or whatever, right?
Sure.
Point being is just there's different variables out there. You can't just say X or step 1, step 2, step 3.
That's correct.
Now, you also mentioned on direct that if the suspect or actor is conscious, coherent, interacting with the officers, talking to them, you don't need to check the pulse.
That's correct.
Checking the front of the pulse is to determine whether you need to apply CPR.
Typically, yes.
And so if there's I guess, let me ask you in terms of this test, if the actor is talking, interacting with the law enforcement officers, and the law enforcement officer decides to flip them on their back and start applying CPR, is that a pass or a fail?
That would probably be a fail. I mean, we don't necessarily go down that road, but yes, that would be a fail.
Let me put it in other words. This test does not teach officers to give CPR to individuals who are talking to them. Is that fair?
That's fair. That's correct.
In terms of the section for coherency, is there a script that the officers need to go through, or is it user judgment? If they're interacting, if they're making sense to you, then that's coherency.
Yeah, that'd be correct. As long as they're communicating appropriately, slurred words and things like that might be an indication of some medical stuff, possibly other things. But yeah, in general, there's not a script. It's judgment.
In other words, going back to what we said originally, you're not training robots, you're training human beings who can use and exercise their judgment. Is that fair?
Yes.
Now, I also see here call for rescue. Is that calling, typically speaking, Aurora Fire?
Yes.
That is your Aurora Police Department's rescue.
Yes. We'll call fire and then they'll send the appropriate ambulance companies to come and assist.
Now, I wasn't sure if there's one missing here, so I wanted to ask you. I see it review, take pressure off neck, lay them by the side, et cetera, down to notify. Okay. Is there anything there after call for rescues that says fight rescue, override medical decisions?
Sustained. It's up there.
There's nothing missing on that list. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Thank you, sir. Those are, well, if I can actually have 1 second. Thank you for your time, sir. Those are all my questions.
You redirect.
I will get you out of here by 5. So this particular test is still the best case scenario. And I guess actually, can we have that screen? Sorry. This particular test that happens at the academy is best case scenario in a blue mat room.
Yes.
And so even though it is still 100% standard that you test them on, it is still the minimum proficiencies at this best case scenario. Is that accurate to say?
Minimum proficiencies.
As in they must pass this in the best case
Yes.
scenario?
Yes.
Okay. Can we bring up that practical list? And I'm blanking on the, is it 278? Thank you. Oh, and Your Honor, would we be able to get that screen? Thank you. And I'm sorry, I meant the practical carotid list, which I think is 224. That's my apologies. So looking at that top section, I think Mr. Ho talked to you about that right, left, you're doing it 3 times. Is that you allowing a recruit to attempt 3 times to find the correct spot with both sides? Or is it you need to show be 100% on each side 3 times?
This is a practice, if you will. So that they're learning through this script. So they may reposition multiple times on one side just to make sure that they're figuring out what this alignment looks like and that it's properly applied, if you will.
And in this situation, when they are practicing and they're trying all of this, is it one recruit on their own working with the recruit suspect?
Yeah, one recruit, one role player, one instructor watching.
Okay, so it's never like 2 recruits and 1 recruit suspect, or multiple recruits and then 1 recruit suspect?
It's usually one-on-one.
I think Mr. Ho also talked to you about the reason for carotid holds is for officer safety. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Are the follow-ups there for the suspect's safety?
Yes.
Are the follow-ups important? Because even in this controlled setting, it's too dangerous to even do this carotid hold on the recruit suspect that's actually there.
Yes.
I have nothing further. Thank you.
Right. May the witness be excused. All right, you may step down. Folks on the jury, looks like it's a good time to take our weekend break, but I do want you to remember, um, don't come in on Monday. I'll be more careful with my instructions so I don't mess up the time either. Well, my suggestion would be, if possible, go home and typically what I try to do when I drive home after listening to a trial is my drive home's about 20 miles. So I have this special spot at about 10 miles. I try to flush and try to get everything I've dealt with at work out of my mind so I can be kind to my family and interactive. You might want to give that a whirl. But don't form or express any opinions, discuss the case, do no independent research, avoid any press coverage. I'd like to have you back Tuesday morning right around 8:30, and we'll have you up here as quickly as we can to continue with the testimony. Thanks and have a great weekend. All right, the jurors have stepped out. Anything before we break?
But just in terms of, we don't need to address it today. I just wanted to give notice that I think we still do need to address the Doak issue. I understand that reasonable suspicion is not an issue, but in terms of what I anticipate evidence to show later on in terms of training, et cetera, I think there still needs to be some argument made. We don't need to do it tonight. I just wanted to give notice if we could do that Tuesday morning.
All right, well, I've already done it once, and I don't know that I'm going to vary from that much. Here's my offer. My mentor did this for me, and it took me 3 trials before I could win. No patrol vehicle, no scene. Let's see who can win.
A riddle. Thanks, Judge.
Well, it's because, you know, when you say scene, everybody's talking about, everybody's questions are vague. Where's the scene? If you're talking about is the lawn, the street, what's the scene? That's why I think my mentor taught me that. Oh, it'd be $100 gift certificate for Texas Day Brazil.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. Checked his cell phone, which was fantastic. There's so.
Oh, okay.
That's the last couple days.
No, it's TMI, I suppose, but my father-in-law recently passed away of dementia, and I got it for 1.5 years, all times of the day and the night.
Yeah.
But are they going to be happening in the future, or they're already?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, because I was missing, I only missed one today. I didn't have in my notebooks. I'll take care of it, since I'll have all day Monday.
Or take the video.